Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is broadcast number 461, October the 5th, 1980, side one of the tape. We break up the half hour and turn over a tape cassette for those that take the program by subscription. I'm sure many of you saw the Arthur Miller play on television, Playing for Time, the story of the concentration camp at Auschwitz. I thought it was an interesting movie. It was a 3-hour movie. It wasn't anything new. Unfortunately, we look at the past as if it was the past and don't relate to what is happening in the present. For all of my 17 years research, I feel that many people, the majority of the people I've come in contact with, are simply doing what those women were doing in the concentration camp, which is playing for time. Most people are political prostitutes. They are looking the other way while multitudes, millions are murdered. Individuals are murdered. Their friends are murdered. Friends of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, men on the balcony like Andrew Young and Jesse Jackson don't speak up, don't want an investigation who killed their friend Martin. These people are nothing but a bunch of pimps and bums who are fiddling and playing their instruments, whatever instruments they're good at, vocal cords or whatever, and looking the other way. Their friends' heads are blown off at the Ambassador Hotel, Robert Kennedy, and in Dallas with John Kennedy, and the murders go on, and the official government, the presidents that succeed them, members of Congress, the personal members of their family, the judges, and people that should be opening up these cases ignore it. The friends are unforgivable. The family members are unforgivable. Researchers have tried to alert to what is going on, the situation that is going on, but there are very few people that want to do anything but play for time. It's happening now, so we don't have to go all the way back to Auschwitz to see the phenomena taking place. I'm going to talk this evening on 3 articles that Jack Anderson came out with recently. I referred to one last week, the Jonestown CIA connections, but Jack Anderson, I've criticized him for a long time for avoiding certain problems in our political scene, that he totally ignores these and goes on to others. For whatever reason, I don't know. He's very selective in the way he chooses his articles. That's his privilege, just as I'm selective in the things that I choose to put on the radio programs. But being a political analyst of many events taking place all around him, he ignored certain news stories for a long time, and now he's hit upon them. He has started this last week talking about Paul Laxalt, who is the manager for Ronald Reagan's campaign. He's the campaign chairman, a Republican from Nevada in the Senate, and he started writing about the connections of Laxalt to Howard Hughes, and that's what the Ronald Reagan campaign is about. We'll go into that. He also brought out memos another day this last week on Laxalt, Howard Hughes, and the racism of the Hughes organization and Laxalt, and using his vote and his office to put down blacks in Nevada and then later in the Senate, United States Senate, and being well paid by the Hughes organization with retainers and carrying on their tradition of racism. Jack Anderson also had an article about Carlos, the terrorist, and being saved by the Central Intelligence Agency. And then I want to go into some items of justice, but justice is very important. It is something to watch. I've watched the courts ever since I started studying the assassination of John Kennedy and then into the other assassinations, and turned on to a book that I've referred to many times on the rearmament of Germany, a section of that book written by A.J. Gumbel, in which he describes Nazi Germany and how Hitler came to power in 1933. And he describes 400 political assassinations that he wrote about in the 30s, but I've never seen the book. I'm sure it was destroyed by Hitler. And Gumbel then said that the killing of the people wasn't as difficult as keeping the semblance of justice, that the courts had to be overturned so that the guilty were loose and free to do the killings again, and a person may not be totally innocent, but he may not be the person responsible entirely for the crime he was charged, or they would say he was escaping or that he commit suicide, and that person would be slain by the Nazi courts, and then the court hearings would be over, or the court was quieted down in cases that should have been getting more attention. So it was the manipulation of the courts in Germany that was taking place, and it's the manipulation of the courts in the United States today that concerns me and that is taking place. The Laxalt article that Howard Hughes, that Jack Anderson referred to last week, this was September 29th, 1980, it was in the San Francisco Chronicle. It was also in the Monterey Herald. The Monterey Herald has a much longer article. We get 5 inches more of Jack Anderson, and it seems important sections are deleted from the San Francisco paper, and I've mentioned this before. He brought in the fact that new documents, they're new to some people, and some of us haven't seen all of them, of course. New documents are being published in a book by an author, Michael Drosnin. I mentioned him on a tape, the cassette, about a year ago, a book called Citizen Hughes, in his own words, How Howard Hughes Tried to Buy America. This is based upon documents that were stolen from the Howard Hughes headquarters in 1974. And Jack Anderson refers to this book. Interesting that the title is How Hughes Tried to Buy America in the past tense. The Hughes organization is very much intact today. The network of buying off politicians, the blackmailing, the under-the-table subterfuge, the connection of the CIA, the mafia, organized crime with the politicians, the Resorts International Combine. The Hughes organization, as it existed and as it has continued to exist, is not dead. The title, How Hughes Tried to Buy America, is a bad word, as I say, using the past tense, because later in the article, and I'm going to refer to it in case you didn't see it, the subject comes up and Paul Laxalt asked the FBI to find out if Howard Hughes was actually alive when he was in Nevada. And that's an open-ended question to this day. Did he die before he ever got to Nevada, or some interim between the Nevada and 1976 when he was legally dead? Of course, I wrote an article for Playgirl in 74 that he had died in April of 1971. But if Howard Hughes was not in Nevada, and Senator Paul Laxalt asked J. Edgar Hoover to go into it, and Hoover said absolutely not, and Robert Mayhew was an FBI man, so Hoover could have gone to him. If Laxalt was dealing with what he referred to as a possible hoax, then the hoax could be going on continuously, because in this article, Jack Anderson brings up the question of whether or not Hughes was in fact in Las Vegas and whether it was a hoax. He refers to the fact that Robert Mayhew worked for Howard Hughes, and these memos that are available, that are surfacing in the book, are correspondence between Howard Hughes and Robert Mayhew. Mayhew was an agent from the Central Intelligence Agency. He had been working with the CIA since 1960, when he set up, well, maybe longer before, in counterintelligence. But for Hughes in the CIA in 1960, with assassination teams that he set up that were confirmed in the Senator Church Committee, this is in 1975, those hearings. But Mayhew worked for the CIA and he worked for the FBI, and he moved to Las Vegas when the Hughes empire moved into Vegas in 66 and shared a house with Mae Dalitz of organized crime, who was part of the assassination team that the CIA had asked Mayhew to work with. Mae Dalitz then went on to La Costa. He formed La Costa in California. But a very close buddy of Robert Mayhew's during this interim was John Rosselli. He was murdered and found sunken off of a Florida coast at the time the House Select Committee on Assassinations was going to call John Rosselli. Sam Giancana was murdered before. Oh, John Rosselli had testified, and it was Sam Giancana who was murdered a few weeks before he was to testify. So Robert Mayhew of the FBI and the CIA was sharing housing with Mae Dalitz and worked closely with John Rosselli of organized crime. This is an important point because the memos going back and forth between Hughes go to Robert Mayhew. Mayhew never saw Howard Hughes. Memos go to Paul Laxalt, who never saw Howard Hughes. Chester Davis, who worked for Howard Hughes, never saw Howard Hughes. One of the memos had to do with working with Paul Laxalt and giving him a lot of money. This is a quotation from the newspaper this week. To make the Laxalt deal work, we have to find a means of motivation. When I have a real tough assignment, I search for 2 ingredients. 1, a man who can do the job if he truly wants to. This is the senator of Nevada that went on to become, the governor of Nevada that went on to become senator. 2, the means of furnishing a consideration to this man who will be of such a nature and such an amount as to be well nigh overpowering in its effect upon the man. Now, money was transacted to Paul Laxalt. It went to the law office of his brother, who was officiated with the lawyer in charge of the gaming tables. In Nevada, special favors were given to a corporation called the Hughes Empire without ever having seen Howard or getting signatures for him to get all of these 7 casinos. The memo said, "Now, Bob, I think Laxalt can be brought to a point where he will just about entrust his entire political future to his relationship with us. I think we must convince him beyond a shadow of a doubt that I intend to back him up with unlimited support right into the White House in 1972. Now, these memos were taken out of a safe in 1974, and he wanted Paul Laxalt in the White House in 72. It's interesting to combine that with the William Colby Howard Baker reports on Watergate and the evidence of Watergate and the glasshouse tapes of Louis Tackwood that G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt worked with the Los Angeles Police Department and intended to kill Richard Nixon at the San Diego conventions in 1972. They were down in San Diego. And then they were quickly moved to Miami in April of that year before the conventions. And after Nixon was Watergated by the same people from the Squad 19 that was going to have him killed at a football field at the time of the conventions, and make Spiro Agnew the President of the United States, and then Paul Laxalt could be selected as the Vice President. So the goal of Hughes isn't different than what was going to transpire. Now, when Richard Nixon was Watergated with that Scotch tape, the very first thing he did within just minutes of his realizing what was coming down at the Watergate Hotel was to pull the rug out under Spiro Agnew to make sure that Agnew didn't become president. And I'm sure by Richard Nixon doing that, it kept Paul Laxalt out of being appointed vice president under Spiro Agnew. So the years have passed, and now Ronald Reagan is running for president come November, and the man running his campaign, who will be in his cabinet, very close to Ronald Reagan, the 9-to-5 president, so Paul Laxalt can make the decisions from 5 p.m. to 9 in the morning if Reagan's asleep. The man that the Hughes organization wanted in the White House will, in fact, be very close to the White House within 6 weeks from now. As I say, Richard Nixon pulled the rug out from Spiro Agnew very quickly and had him removed before Nixon resigned from office as President of the United States. There was an article this week about Spiro Agnew, the federal judge who accepted his resignation, the no contest plea. U.S. Judge Walter Hoffman said this week that he did it quickly. He said, if I hadn't accepted the plea, Agnew would have been indicted of many charges, but he would have held back and contested those. And when Nixon was out of office, Agnew would have been president. And the judge said he automatically would have been president of the United States, and God knows that would have been a tragedy. It was a wise decision to get Agnew out before President Nixon got out of office. Robert Mayhew wrote back to Howard Hughes, this is among these other memos that's printed by Jack Anderson this week, in quotes, Governor Laxalt has started to ask me precisely what his assignment will be in our organization. That's interesting because after this correspondence was going back and forth, Laxalt was not the governor of Nevada. He went on to be a senator, a more important position in the United States Senate, and now, as I say, he's the campaign manager for probably the next president of the United States. Robert Mayhew wrote to Howard Hughes in 1970, keep in mind that this is a combine, a conglomerate. It's not a person. He said Laxalt is very anxious to discuss his future employment with us. And then Mayhew wrote, my guess is that he, Laxalt, will hit us for a retainer. Jack Anderson went on to say that Laxalt's law firm got $180,000, his brother's firm, Peter Laxalt, and that Laxalt also got other money. In return, the favor he did was to circumvent the procedure by which the Hughes organization could buy up 7 casinos in Las Vegas and have unlimited organized crime, skimming money, prostitution, blackmail, keeping Vegas, the city, of more suicides than any other city in the United States, and I'm sure that 1/3 of those are murder. Hughes got the license for 7 casinos. He didn't have to go through the other routes. He was never seen. And then when he left in 1970, Resorts International and Intertel took over and literally owned most of Las Vegas. Jack Anderson wrote, in a bizarre twist, it turns out that Laxalt had never met Howard Hughes. He had serious doubts that the man was still alive. In February of 1967, February the 12th, a confidential memo was written. This is 1 year after Hughes' organization was in Nevada, and no one had seen him. This is a year after he moved in. No one, including the governor of Nevada, has ever personally seen Howard Hughes. There is grave concern among the Nevada gaming authorities and Governor Laxalt that a great hoax could be perpetuated on the state officials. And then the memo went on to say that Laxalt and the Nevada Gaming Commission wanted the FBI to determine that Howard Hughes is alive and that they are actually licensing a live individual. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover ordered his men to have absolutely nothing to do with this. Despite his doubts of whether or not Hughes was ever in Nevada, Paul Laxalt, now campaign manager to Ronald Reagan, subsequently helped the Hughes organization get their casinos. And the article by Jack Anderson does bring up the question of the existence of Howard Hughes. I'll do more on that on another broadcast or tape because I have a lot I want to cover this evening. But J. Edgar Hoover was the head law enforcement official of the United States. It is a law to kidnap people to take them across state lines. Howard Hughes was taken from California to Boston to Nevada. There was no evidence that he was alive. Hoover had a request to investigate him. Mayu, who was being paid by the Hughes organization and lived with Mo Dalitz and worked with John Rosselli and assassination teams of Giancana and organized crime members. Mayu was a member of the FBI at the same time he worked with the crime figures, and as an agent could have gone to the apartment of Howard Hughes, the man who paid him, and find out if, in fact, he was Hughes. The FBI had the authority to see if a man in that hotel room, whose name was Vance Cooper, had been kidnapped, had been drugged under subterfuge, who was kept in that hotel room and impersonated Howard Hughes. They had the right to go in there, and FBI didn't do it. And the reason they didn't do it, I firmly believe, is the same reason that J. Edgar Hoover never went into the Nazi connections in this country. It has to do with his being vice president of Interpol, which was Adolf Hitler's police organization. Until we were bombed at Pearl Harbor, Hoover was working with Meyer Heydrich and the top Nazis of Nazi Germany, Kaltenbrunner, and the war criminals of Germany. And J. Edgar Hoover had pro-Nazi, anti-labor, anti-black, anti-Jewish feelings. His Jewishness extended to maybe Meyer Lansky, a mob figure. Bugsy Siegel was wiped out, but J. Edgar Hoover worked with Nazis and organized crime, and his role as head of the FBI was to ignore the Howard Hughes story. And I also believe that the subterfuge of the Hughes organization has been for the Nazification of America. I think it is the umbrella of bringing Nazis here from Germany under NASA into the Defense Department, into Lockheed, into the space stations. And it's no coincidence that the Hughes organization funded Richard Nixon in 1946 to become a member of the House of Representatives when he ran against Jerry Voorhees, and then Richard Nixon in 1950 was bringing Nikolai Malaksa, a top Nazi from Romania, to his office in Whittier and then down to Argentine into the Odessa organization. The memos that Paul Laxalt wrote asking the director of the FBI to check out Hughes were not done. But that wasn't just J. Edgar Hoover's problem, because Laxalt kept dealing with this party, being the governor of the state, and not knowing who he was dealing with and taking money from that organization up to this present day. Another article after that one that was in the paper a day later was more on Laxalt. This is a Howard Hughes article about Paul Laxalt killing a civil rights bill at the request of Howard Hughes. They felt if they gave him enough money, there's notes and memos here, that if they gave him enough money that he would kill bills in Nevada when he had a chance as the governor. He lobbied behind the scenes to kill open housing bills and pretended on the front to be supporting it. He was active in continuing the racist intentions of the Hughes organization. And in those years, that was the time that Candy Jones wrote about. She was trained in the CIA to hate blacks, hate Jews, hate Italians. That was part of her mind-controlled program. There's another memo here of the Hughes organization, which stated after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King in 1968, that's the era when the Hughes organization was in Nevada from 66 to 70. It refers to Dr. Martin Luther King and said there'll be tremendous pressure to adopt a more liberal attitude towards integration, open housing, and employment of more Negroes after King was killed. But they went on to say, I feel the Negroes have already made enough progress to last the next 100 years, and there's no such thing as overdoing it. The Hughes organization has been instrumental in selecting the presidents of the United States, the justices of the Supreme Court, on down to the local police department. And this one article about the Laxalt, behind-the-scene maneuvering for racism, I think is important, coming out at this time of Jack Anderson. I have one memo that was published, I think it was in Playboy a while back. It's also the copy of a directive in Mexico Hotel when they were cashing in that body that was supposed to be used in 1976, and they were shredding articles. And this was to Chester Davis. He wants all our files on our CIA relations destroyed. This is also to apply to everything we have on Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Paul Laxalt, and O'Callaghan. O'Callaghan was the governor of Nevada. He wants this done immediately, and any taped conversations are also to be handled this way. This information about Laxalt, Nixon, Ford, and O'Callaghan, and now Laxalt really is the man behind Reagan as he runs him into the White House. So you get Nixon, Ford, Reagan under the control of what is the Hughes organization that is a much, much bigger monster. Jack Anderson also had an article on Jackal. That's Carlos. I referred to him on the last few tapes, linked to the arms merchants Turpel and Corcola, who fled the country recently instead of being charged with murder and gun running and training terrorists. I mentioned them 2 weeks ago in an article in Nation magazine about Carlos and the Munich Olympic Games being behind the killing of the Jewish athletes. Carlos bombed the Israeli bank in London in 1974. He shot a Zionist, Joseph Sif, in London in 1973. He planted bombs in a Jewish newspaper in 1974 in Paris. He organized the murder of the Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympic Games. Those are just the anti-Semitic efforts that Carlos has done that I refer to a few of them. And this article of Jack Anderson is a story how the CIA saved Carlos, that they had picked him up in 1974 and an assassination squad. It's interesting, he refers to Operation Condor. Jack Anderson has referred to them several times. That is a group of assassins trained in Chile at Colonia Dignidad that borders on Argentina. And he said that Operation Condor, for one reason or another, wanted to wipe out Carlos. I guess it was time for him to go. They had reasons they wanted him killed. And he refers to this Condor as being a six-nation consortium of killers of South American dictatorships. Well, of course, Condor is the heritage of Permindex that included London and South Africa and Italy, Argentina and Chile. It's six nations, but they're not all South American. Operation Condor had its headquarters, Credit Suisse was one of the bankers, and money from Montreal. The money going down to Colonia Dignidad comes from Germany and is funded from South Africa at the present time. But the article about Carlos says that he was going to be killed, and the Central Intelligence Agency, according to certain documents, came in and spared his life. Now, if they knew where to find him, they could bring him in and charge him for these bombings and these murders, and multi-murders all over the country, bombing of airports. Besides the Jewish problem, he worked with the Palestinians in Jordan against King Hussein, and hit London cocktail parties and airports, and worked with the Japanese Red Army, Baader Meinhof, and all the terrorists gang that we used to believe, or the Tooth Fairy told us, were coming from the left. Well, Carlos was going to be killed in a mafia-like precision. He was going to be murdered, but the Central Intelligence Agency stepped in, warned the government, don't touch him, tell the Condor nations to call off the murder of Carlos, and it goes on to suggest that Carlos was a CIA informant. So for all the years that I've talked about the terror on the right looking like the terror on the left, it's very significant that Jack Anderson had those articles today. Incidentally, there was an article in a newspaper today in the Washington Post, this week from the Washington Post, on Carlos and Turpel and Corcola. Turpel has left the country, and the article says that Turpel, the CIA man who armed Idi Amin and Gaddafi in the Middle East, has a lawyer in common with a Abscam defendant, Representative John Jenrette of South Carolina. He's been investigated this past week. He's been under investigation by the courts because of the Abscam story. He has been allegedly involved in a lot of narcotic traffic and terrorism that comes out of South Carolina. And now the attorney, Kenneth Michael Robinson, Jenrette's attorney, is also Turpel's attorney. Now, the example of using the terrorism of the left and making it the terror of the right and making it look like the left is exemplified in an article this week that came out about the FBI and their court case of being the wiretapping and the Weatherman case. And the excuse for the defense of the FBI of having to do burglaries and secret mail openings and entries was the kind of terrorism in the United States, such as the Arabs, the Al-Fatah, that were involved in the Munich kidnapping of the athletes and then the murdering them at the airport. Well, if the defense of the FBI violence and terrorism in the United States is based upon international terrorism, and the international terrorism is really done by the CIA, the story exemplifies very clearly why the SLA or the Al-Fatah or the Red Brigade are set up. They're set up so that the police state has the muscle to go in and wiretap and bug and follow you. The CIA and the Defense Department creates the terrorists. Then the law enforcement come in and say, there's so much terrorism, we need more jails and more police. The article this week from the United Press says more FBI burglaries of Arab offices revealed, and it's the story of the Information Center in 1972 looking for members of the Al-Fatah and the manhunt of the PLO following the Munich, the murders at the Olympic Games. And while the investigation and the defense of the FBI in illegal activities is going on, other articles in the newspapers at the same time are saying that those terrorists were associated with the Central Intelligence Agency. The problem with getting the news in, say, any newspaper, any single set of papers, or 10 papers a day like I take, or 20 or 30, is that you take one story of what the FBI is saying in defense of their trial, and you take another story about Turpel from the Washington Post or Jack Anderson, and you put them together and you get a total different ingredient of what terrorism is and how it is used for a police state to get its muscles. Another article, the Associated Press today in the San Jose Mercury, terrorism is the worst yet to come. An article, according to the CIA, 579 people were killed by terrorism last year. But it doesn't say if 560 of those were done by CIA agents, such as, they quote, the Aldo Moro kidnapping by the Red Brigades, which later has turned out to be linked to the right-wing terrorists. They use the example of the Olympic Games in Munich, the Palestinians shot at three Japanese at Lod Airport in Tel Aviv, the kidnapping of Patty Hearst and the Symbionese Liberation Army, and the hijacking of Air France, the jet plane that ended with an Israeli raid in Uganda. Now, the Uganda Army and the PLO operation was funded by Samuel Cummings, Turpel, Frank Turpel, George Corcola, the Central Intelligence Agency. It's been confirmed that they were arming and giving the planes and equipment to Idi Amin. And then when all the terrorism comes down, the CIA comes out with large pieces of information for congressional testimonies, for courts, And every bit of terrorism that the CIA cites in this article, and the word CIA is in this, it's a half-page article, just today's newspaper, and they use the CIA references about 20 or 30 times, and everyone they're referring to in the last 3 months has gone back to their very agencies, like Frank Churchill of the Central Intelligence Agency and Carlos of the CIA and their operations. So the purpose of that kind of terrorism is to make it look as if the left is out of control like a wildfire, and the only solution to have is the police department. There are two kinds of terrorism, and I'll just mention them before we take a break at this half hour. There's the counterintelligence terrorism, where the far right does it and makes believe the left did it, so the left is punished and discredited. Then there's the Nazi Klan terrorism, the burning of the synagogue, bombing of synagogue in France this week, killing Jewish people at prayer, or the training of the Klan in Alabama or Mississippi, where they say, Klan wants race war. They say, I hate you. I hate blacks. I hate Jews. Let's get it on. Let's have our war. We're ready. We're armed. We hate you. They're not pretending to help them and then bombing, or they're not bombing and doing a counterintelligence. What these people are doing, the Klan and the Nazis, is saying, this is what we are. We don't like you. We're going to kill you. That is regular terrorism, and counterintelligence terrorism creates violence and murder and makes it look like one segment of society did it when it was actually the other segment. Now, it's a half hour. We're going to take a 60-minute break here. It's Mae Brussell and Carmel, and then we'll be back on for the second half of this program. All right, this is Mae Brussell back with you talking about justice now, as I mentioned in the first part of the program. I want to just keep up with a few of the cases of counterintelligence and another important so-called suicide in the hands of the police. This week, a case that's important for my research. Another article which was long overdue was Jack Anderson's article that I referred to last week on the relationship of the Central Intelligence Agency to Jonestown. That case has hardly been opened. The surface hasn't been scratched. Larry Layton is going to be brought to San Francisco to face trial for the murder of Leo Ryan, of killing a congressman, and for assisting in murders at the airport. It will be an interesting trial. See what happens. The first thought of defense was that he was brainwashed. An aide to the lawyer said they may use this as one of the examples of his defense, being as 900 people killed themselves for Jim Jones. They were all under some kind of brainwash, and therefore when he went to the airport and intended to bomb the airplane that everybody was on, he was still under the suicidal influence of people who killed themselves. On the other hand, if you can prove that only maybe 200 people intended to kill themselves and the others were outright murdered at Jonestown and were under experimentations of mind control that were beyond Jim Jones, then that represents a different kind of defense. Joe Holsinger, the aide to Leo Ryan, Congressman Leo Ryan, was with me this week, and we went over some information, and I gave him those copies of Time and Newsweek, December the 4th, 1978. At the time that your best friend and long associate is slain and you're enveloped in such a terrible tragedy, it's hard to analyze what came down at that moment. And I illustrated and circled the cover and the inside pages of Time and Newsweek that the people there on the floor by the vat and poison and on the grounds and in the dining hall had markers on them, not all of them. Some people had a marker on their left leg, some on a right leg, some on an arm, and that these were plastic kind of markers that are used for experimentations of people where they're given medications and they change colors. And Mr. Holsinger wasn't aware of that, but a woman who was with him perked up right away. She said, that's right. We were told that when people went in there before the guy and his army cleaned out, before they identified, before they turned them over, when Time and Newsweek and the other news media came in to take the pictures, the people were lying exactly as they were. They were face down, so the marker didn't mean anything, or everybody would have a right wrist. By the time these people were removed in bags, they were 4 days in the hot sun with maggots and blisters, and you couldn't tell black from white. They were so decomposed, and yet they were perfect condition when the media was allowed to see them. and they had these markers. So I gave him a lot of information on mind control of the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Department working on the people down there, including Jim Jones. So if Larry Layton was a victim of mind control, it wasn't that Jim Jones did it to him on his own. He wasn't a self-styled Rasputin who ran the machinery. The machinery came from the Defense Department and from Boston and Los Angeles and Stanford Research, UCLA School, and Stanford Research and Boston Hospital. And the question is, why were these people or other people in the hands of Mr. Burnham down in Guyana allowed to be experimented upon away from home? Later, in a few weeks, I'll cover an article for you on the politics and destabilization of Guyana, a wonderful article in Covert Action Information Bulletin. But for those of you who take the tape cassettes or those of you who want a printed bibliography of the broadcast this evening or other evenings, you can write to me. And I have the address of the magazine that you can get, Covert Action, a long story of the politics of Guyana from 1960 to 1980. You have to study that article to get the destabilization process that was going on with Mr. Taylor and Alan Dulles and the Central Intelligence Agency in Great Britain from 1960. And Jim Jones was there in 1963 on the way home from Brazil, where he worked with the CIA for a year and a half. And then he was sent down there later. He knew exactly where he would be 10 years later. In 1973, he was sent down with these people, and he had visited the place in 1963. One thing about the Covert Action article, which has been published in other stories or taken from there, that I do want to correct for you, in the article it has a list of certain facts about Jonestown, cash that was found there, U.S. criminals on probation or parole, the use of the MK Ultra program of the United States government, and so forth. But then, just as a non sequitur, it said in the article, Leo Ryan's name appears in Who's Who in the CIA by Julius Mader. Now, whether or not Ryan had worked with the CIA or not, just as William Sullivan worked for the FBI, or William Harvey for the CIA, or Sheffield Edwards, or Dorothy Hunt, the CIA is notorious in killing its own. So whether he was in the CIA or not had nothing to do with the destabilization of Guyana. But the point is that they have made a mistake in this covert action, and I'm sending them a letter this week to tell them. Leo Ryan is the one that was slain down in Guyana, is Leo Joseph Ryan, and he was born May the 5th, 1925. That's his birth date. The Leo Ryan that they have in Who's Who in the CIA was a totally different Ryan. The one that was killed was in submarine service in the Navy. The one in Who's Who in the CIA is in the Army. They're different birth dates, different locations, different employments. I don't doubt that there isn't a Leo John Ryan that worked for the Central Intelligence Agency that was born in 1923. But the point is, it isn't Leo Joseph Ryan who was killed down in Guyana. So in the last few weeks, Jack Anderson has talked about the CIA and Jonestown. He's talked about Carlos working and protected by the CIA, and he's getting into Paul Laxalt and the Hughes organization, their racism, their doubt whether Hughes was alive. I'm very interested in Anderson doing these things because those of you that know me know that I've been carrying on these stories for as long as the very first news came out about them and pursuing these stories. And what we need is more action of people in the media, such as Jack Anderson, to call attention to the fact that these conspiracies do exist and that they should be investigated. A man that's running Ronald Reagan's campaign, such as Paul Laxalt, who's taking money from a corporation that wanted him in the White House, when we have this wonderful 9-to-5 president coming up, would wonder if Paul Laxalt won't be there, as I say, to represent their wishes. Last week, I talked about various violences that came down. I talked about the Munich Olympic Games, not Munich Olympic Games, the Oktoberfest, where there were 12 people that were killed and 144 were wounded. In the first article, there are articles that came out. One said one man blamed for the explosion. Neo-Nazi group suspected in blast that killed 12. Another article, no suspects found in Munich bombing. Well, the articles went on until they had a riotous suspect who was apprehended, and then the suspects were freed in the Munich bombing. And the last that we heard was that the riotous suspects were freed. There were more than one suspect, and then the final is one man blamed in Munich blast, and they pinned it on one student, Gandalf Kohler, a Nazi, and blamed him for 12 deaths and 144 injuries. And then the Oktoberfest, I read, went on very successfully, just as the Olympic Games went on when the athletes were murdered, so that they had a suspect. He was killed. They had other suspects. They were released, and they now say that only one person will be blamed. That is the way the other team that set up the violence, where 144 people were hurt, are able to leave town. I talked about the script for the Somoza killing, how he was in trouble with the government down there for his womanizing, for the news mistress he had selected. He was an embarrassment to Stroessner down there because he was supposed to low-key it after he left his home in Nicaragua. And also it would be a chance to pin his murder on the leftist organization, say it was a defunct group from Argentina, and go through Argentina and Paraguay and bring in hundreds of suspects, which they have done, and rounded up, and then send the funeral to Miami. At the time, the next 2 days, Reagan was going to be in Miami campaigning with the anti-Castro Cubans. When you have a man who's unpopular, who's notorious, as this person is, and unwanted, it's just as convenient to murder him right then at the time of elections. And because of the way he's killed and completely ripped apart, the sympathy is with that man and not what he did to over 100,000 people that he himself had murdered when he was in power. Well, this week there was an article in the Associated Press, Hunt for Somoza Killers Plagued by Questions, a police frame-up, question mark. And the essence of the article was, or is, that in private conversations they're blaming the United States Central Intelligence Agency for the murder of Somoza, that they identified one man, Hugo Alfredo Irizon. The officials claimed that he plotted the assassination. He was shot to death, and now there's a question of whether or not it was the body. The parents, who saw him in 1973, haven't seen him for a long time, and they were not allowed to see the body. So the police, again, had a group of 6 they were looking for. They went in and took a typical Lee Harvey Oswald, who was reading a book on Karl Marx that I mentioned before. But when I mentioned last week, I didn't have the article. It came out October the 3rd, that in Paraguay, they're talking about the fact that the CIA killed Somoza. I'm sure they did, and I'm sure my reasons were right. Another article, Paraguay opposition leader is arrested. Police arrested opposition leader Dominio Leono, and they confiscated documents and personal papers, and he's held incommunicado. In other words, anybody who's against Stroessner and the Nazi dictatorship that's in power can be rounded up on the whipped-up emotions following the Somoza killing. So sure enough, this week they were blaming the CIA, and sure enough, they were going out and rounding up the opposition to Stroessner, the little bit that's left. I also mentioned last week on the tape that it was open hunting season for blacks. I talked about the killings in Utah and in Buffalo, and the joggers shot at Salt Lake City, snipers in San Francisco. And right after that, in the news this week, following my broadcast with you last week, there was an article on the shooting of Verdun, Jordan, linked to other killings. And it goes into a mystery man. He's described as a mystery man. They don't know his income, and he's from Alabama, and he's wanted for similarities in many murders with weapons. They know he has an alias, and he uses that alias. He traveled to Cincinnati, where he killed 2 black youths. He shot 2 black joggers in Utah, Salt Lake City, and the white women that they were jogging with survived. He killed 4 black people in Buffalo. He's wanted in 5 states and suspected of shooting and trying to kill Verdun Jordan of the Urban League, the president of the Urban League. The important thing about this case, again, they're looking for Joseph Paul Franklin. He had a high-powered scope he left in one car. He was in the police department, just as Carlos and these other terrorists are, and he was allowed to leave. He left out the window. He escaped in Florence, Indiana, even though he was wanted for these killings. I told you the news story calls them random. Now they have narrowed them down that they're not random. That's what I said last week. They are specifically black people. One article, this was October the 3rd, in the paper, still calls it random killings. Victims apparently were picked at random in at least 6 shootings. All of them were black. The targets were black men. In 4 instances, they were shooting in the company of white women, and in several cases, white women had died. He had a high-powered rifle. 6 cases of ammunition and so forth in his car. Was in the police department in Indiana where he had done shootings, and he's at large. The police, in quote, let him escape. Another example of the courts just not functioning, typical to Nazi Germany and typical to the way these crimes are solved. Another case that I've wanted to go into with you for a long time is the Strangler story. We'll get to that eventually. The link of Los Angeles Strangler to the public officials in Los Angeles, the use of prostitutes, snuff murder movies. This Bianci has been arrested. He was arrested in Bellingham, Washington, not in Los Angeles, even though he and his cousin worked with the Los Angeles Police Department, this Bianci. He had a woman who was visiting him in the jail quite often, and then she left Los Angeles, and Angelo Buono, B-U-O-N-O, is also under indictment for these Hillside Strangler murders. This woman was visiting Bianci in the jail in Los Angeles, and usually they keep a pretty tight record of visiting these people. Then she went up to Bellingham, Washington, and disguised herself as an actress from Dallas, Texas, and took a woman at a hotel and strangled her. The woman almost died. And she was strangling a woman named Kim Breed in Bellingham, Washington, a county employee. Again, they worked heavily with county employees, and her purpose was to leave directives that the real strangler is still at large, that Bianci couldn't be the strangler because the pattern was going on, and she got her instructions and was in the jail learning his technique of strangling in the Los Angeles jail so that she could murder people up in Washington, and then he would be released because they would believe the murder was at large. This is a man that worked with law enforcement people in Los Angeles and had strong links, as I say, to police officials and law enforcement officials in Los Angeles. And it's similar to the case I brought up last week of the Zodiac killer, of a member of the San Francisco Police Department writing Zodiac notes or impersonating the Zodiac killer. The mass violences like the Zodiac killings or the Hillside Stranglers or the Son of Sam cases are so far more complicated than the average person knows about. And again, that goes into the category of terror and counterintelligence. Now, there's one other article that I'll conclude with. I may have a few more I'll have time to bring up, but this is a subject which is close to me that goes into the category of call it speculation or what you will, or hearsay. I'll give you the article and then I'll give you my opinions on it. This article is out of Brazil this week, October the 4th. That was yesterday. Ex-Nazi officer commits suicide. Now, this is a man, again, who's been in the custody of the police department, who dies. Some escape from the police, some are killed in the police department. The man's name is Gustav Franz Wagner. You know, Wagner, well-known name in Germany. He was living in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He was in the custody of the police department because at the time of the celebration of Hitler's birthday 2 years ago, he was photographed. Wagner lived in Germany until 1950. He moved down to Brazil using his own name. He was responsible for at least 250,000 deaths of Jews and Poles at Sobibor extermination camp. He worked there in Poland in 1942-43 at the extermination camps. After the war, he lived comfortably in Europe. In 1950, he went down to Brazil. Every year, there's a large German colony. They're all over South America, Uruguay, Paraguay, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, but particularly in Brazil, there's an annual birthday party for Adolf Hitler in April. And it was at this birthday party, the newspaper article describes, this is the story, that he was identified from a newspaper photograph taken at a birthday anniversary party for Hitler near Rio de Janeiro. Wagner turned himself in after federal police said that they wanted him in connection with the extradition. The police didn't want him. I remember that birthday party because There's a lot of people that have never taken seriously the possibility, I'm not saying it's true, the possibility that Adolf Hitler left the bunker and was flown out of Germany and took the U-2 boat down to Argentina and Antarctica. From doing radio work for being on the air 9 years and doing research for 17 years into this aspect, I get into the iffy where people say you can't prove that Hitler is alive, but there are many books about the possible escape and the story of Hitler's leaving Europe. And there are many stories about this famous birthday party that takes place. There are other birthday celebrations in Europe in April, Hitler's birthday parties in absentia, anniversaries. But I have heard, and from what I read about Nazi documents, that Hitler is at these parties. And this Wagner, somebody took a picture of a group of people at a gate. I think I have it among my papers from 1978, April 78. And Wagner realized that he was recognized. The Brazilian, somebody right away let out that Wagner was seen there, this man that had run those concentration camps. And he went to the Brazil police for security. He said, "Protect me." And he went to them. They didn't pull him up. There's no country that would extradite him to Europe all this time. And I think that's interesting. Israel legally couldn't do it because they weren't a country when he committed the crimes. France wouldn't do it because it wasn't their problem. Poland said, we don't want him. We're behind the Iron Curtain, so we don't have the jurisdiction to bring him here. It's not the same Polish government it was when he did it. West Germany didn't want him. And the only one reason, I think, that they didn't want him, because they had him and he was in the custody of the police, could be the company that he kept at that party. Now, a man who had been in Argentina and had studied the life of Adolf Hitler, he's working with somebody who was making a movie on Adolf Hitler, had said that Hitler, I saw this man about a year ago when we were talking about Hitler, had said that Hitler left Brazil because of Wagner being recognized and whatever would follow after that, or maybe he would use it as his defense. This is what I was told, and that Hitler never returned to Argentina or Antarctica. He had a complicated Berchtesgaden built down in Antarctica with all the comforts that he needed, and there's many, many people living in Antarctica, and he never returned there. This is what I was told, that he was taken to a sanitarium in Switzerland. Now, time will tell. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Maybe we'll never know if, in fact, age 90, Adolf Hitler is alive. I usually don't use my radio time for speculation, but the story of this man dying in the custody of the police department, held there for 2 years and dying in the custody of the police department, is interesting because he had a home, a nice home in Brazil, as many of the Germans do. He wasn't charged with any crime. The police didn't arrest him. They were protecting him from being extradited. And it goes on to say that the reason he was hospitalized was that he was depressed when he was discovered. When they began to recognize him in Brazil and he began to remember his experiences during World War II, he got depressed. Well, you better believe he got depressed. Just remembering the experiences may be that he thought he'd be sent back, and maybe his defense. He said, and it's in this article this week about his death, that he said, I only obeyed orders, I only obeyed orders. It'd be interesting if the man who was giving the orders to him was at his party. That would be a good defense. And the article begins, Gustav Franz Wagner, who said he, in quotes, only obeyed orders, committed suicide this last Friday at his isolated farm in Sao Paulo state. And then it goes on that he said, I knew what went on in the concentration camps. I only obeyed orders. That was the defense at Nuremberg, the famous defense. Well, Wagner is now dead. Simon Wiesenthal didn't want him. I don't like to break illusions. I was going to say I'd like to. There are many people that put Simon Wiesenthal, the Nazi hunter, on a grand pedestal. He found Adolf Eichmann. There's people like Farrago that claim that the agreement was between the South American countries and the other Nazis. Simon, you can have Eichmann, go try him in Israel and give him the full sentence. That will leave us with Martin Bormann and Mengele and Wagner and all the others, the top Nazis. Hundreds and thousands of them were able to assemble and meet and unite and become politically active throughout the entire world. And I don't know anything about the background of Wiesenthal. I've talked to him personally on the telephone. He has never been interested in apprehending or bringing back a Nazi. Really interested. This article says that Wiesenthal recognized Wagner by a picture, and the police were protecting him. That wasn't the way it went down in 1978 in April. I remember when Wagner was identified, and it wasn't by Wiesenthal. And in the past 2 years, I've never heard him give one speech about Wagner down there in Brazil. He went to the White House and got an accolade from Jimmy Carter. He collects 20,000 ribbons for getting Eichmann. And he's let the other biggies slip in and out of the United States and work with our Air Force, with our defense industries, people like Walter Dornberger and Skorzeny, setting up our terrorist teams, anti-terrorist teams. And I could go on and on for the big story Nazis that got away, even possibly Himmler, who was supposed to be in New York City, a journalist in New York City. This is a tragedy that the Jewish people have sat back, and when I bring up the subject of these Nazis and how they have surfaced and how important they are in our political scene today, and they all worked with the Hughes Empire and Paul Laxalt and the Reagan gang. That's what the legacy is going to come out in 5 or 6 weeks. When the election is over, then you're really going to see things pop a la techniques of Adolf Hitler. The legacy is there. And whenever I bring up a subject about Wagner or Mengele or Martin Bormann, the answer is, well, wouldn't Wiesenthal get them? The answer is no, he wouldn't, and he didn't, and he's remained very passive. I think I mentioned once before on a radio program that Charles Hyman was writing the book, The Nazi Connections to Errol Flynn, and was in Germany and asked Wiesenthal for the name of a doctor that he wanted to see, and Wiesenthal gave him the runaround and said he was out of town and wasn't available. So Mr. Hyman picked up the phone and looked in a telephone directory. He thought Wiesenthal would have the number because it was a Nazi spy during the war, admitted Nazi spy who bragged about it and was apprehended and was written up in FBI documents. And just by chance, Hyman looked at a phone directory to see a name or family name, and there was the man's name. And he picked up the phone and called him and talked to him himself. And Wiesenthal had told him, he didn't say get it yourself or here's the number, look in the phone book. He said he's out of the country and tried to divert him or discourage him from seeing him. And that's the way the story goes. One more minute on justice being perverted. There are two members of Congress, John Murphy, an important man from Staten Island, New York, and Frank Thompson of Trenton, New Jersey. Two of the most important members of the House have been indicted in the Abscam connections, one linking the London casino and organized crime to New Jersey and the casinos there, and John Murphy being on the board of directors of the Paul Levy Foundation, the classmate of Somoza, and so forth. These two men have asked that their trials be put off till after the election. They want to be elected to the House of Representatives on November the 5th, 1980, before they are charged as criminals or bagmen or linked to the mob or taking pay under the table and photographed and so forth. The court has been nice enough to say you can be elected first and win your constituency, and with that vote of confidence, maybe we won't prosecute you. Just this last week, one woman was slain in her car in Washington, D.C., a radio woman slain broadcasting on the air, and she was part of a group of the International Year of the Child. That was a U.S. commission, and that commission was linked up to organized crime, to Rosalind Carter, to the Vatican, the Gambino family, narcotics traffic. It's interesting. This woman was a graduate of Smith College, president of her class. She worked in New York and San Francisco and was working in the media for the International Year of the Child that was perverted by the crime syndicate and gun running and narcotics traffic, so that the Year of the Child really didn't get off. And I wonder if her murder didn't have to do with something that she picked up about the connections of the mobsters to the front of the International Year of the Child that was used for subterfuge and more dangerous occupations such as gun running and narcotics. Well, we covered a lot of material this week. I'm glad that Anderson is coming out with these things as you read the newspapers every week. If you're new to the Mae Brussell type of broadcasting, save your articles on murders, trials, escapes, suicides, and put them away a few years and get them out again, because We'll analyze them continuously, and then maybe you'll be able to recognize counterintelligence and terror that is directed against us as citizens by the very intelligence agencies that are hired to protect us. The FBI, the CIA, Army intelligence are not supposed to be in the subterfuge, or the police departments. And they let these people escape, leave the offices to go on to do more murders. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. You take care, and I'll be back with you again next week.